Chapter 7. It was foggy and rainy and cold the morning of February 9th, 1818, when Jean-Marie left Écully to go to his new parish at Ars. He had hired a man to carry his scanty clothing, his books, and Father Bailey's bedstead, which, with a few blankets, was his inheritance from his beloved old pastor. Unaccustomed to riding, Father Vianney walked on ahead of the cart. Men left their work, women ran to the doors of their houses to wave good-bye to their beloved priest. The children, his particular charge, cried as they kissed his hand and asked for his blessing, and tiny tots, unstrung by the sadness they did not understand, added their wails to the general lamentation. The priest, however, was intent on the parish to which he was going. The picture of it which the Vicar General had given him showed a place in sad need of reorganization. He framed a greeting to have ready for the first of the parishioners who should come out to welcome him. On that early contact a great deal would depend. As he moved into the valley where Ars lay, the air seemed to become heavy and depressing. A great chateau stood on a hill to the north of the village. In it, Father Vianney had been told he would find a friend, one of the good women whose family had clung to the faith when others were letting it go. When he crossed the boundary line of his new parish, he knelt on the ground to ask divine help and guidance in his work there. Darkness came down as the short, thin, almost emancipated priest trudged onward. Once in a while, now, he would see yellow lamplight shining out of the windows of houses hidden among the trees. But no one seemed aware that their new pastor was coming, or if they did know, they did not care. No one came out with a greeting, no word of welcome was spoken. When he reached the village of Ars, he went directly to the little church which was to be his care. The steeple was gone, destroyed by the revolutionaries in 1793, though the bell had been saved, and now hung on a crazy structure of beams across the rafters of the building. His heart was unhappy at the all too evident neglect in the church itself, a church in which no sanctuary lamp burned because the Blessed Sacrament was not there. The carter unloaded his wagon, said a sad goodbye to his beloved Father Vianney, and started home. The priest cleaned the church as well as he could, straightened out his own mud-walled cottage, and went to bed for his first night in Ars. Before daybreak the next morning, the new Curé of Ars rang the Angelus, wondering as he did so if bell, rafters, and even part of the roof would come crashing down. A small handful of older women, no men and no young people, hurried in for Mass. Knowing that almost all of his parishioners were farmers, Father Vianney decided after Mass that he would walk around each morning and meet them at their work, or call on the families at meal times, when all would be at home. Having been a farmer himself, he knew how their day went, and knew, too, what to talk about with them. His face in repose was certainly not handsome, but his smile, illumined as it was by goodness and love, usually won over the people whom he greeted. When he called at their homes, he was always able to make friends with the children, whom he then urged to come to catechism classes. The oldest and the youngest among his flock were no particular problem. If they had forgotten their way to church, or had never learned it, he felt that it would soon become familiar to them. The young adults were a different matter. A madness for pleasure had swept France in the past years. Work was hard, tiny incomes were heavily taxed. God had been ridiculed as an ancient superstition. The result was that a whole generation had grown up with no knowledge of any commandment except the one which said, "Have a good time wherever and however you can." Sundays and holidays were ideal to these people for a round of worldly pleasure. Those who did not care for roistering simply carried on with their daily work. On Saturday evening a band concert gave the signal for the revels to begin. Sunday morning resounded to more band music, followed by public games and dancing which continued well into the next morning. There was one church in Ars largely ignored, but there were 4 taverns which, particularly on Sundays and holy days, were full to bursting. In the pleasure-mad section of a pleasure-bent country, ours stood out as the center of wild carousals, and people drove in from many miles around to take part in the unrestrained celebration. Father Vianney was sick at heart. In his pulpit he used plain, strong language about these things. But the people who heard him were not the ones he wanted to reach, were not the ones who skipped Mass to go to licentious dances or to get drunk in taverns. Though his congregation did carry the message home, it made little impression. One Sunday he got up very early, long before Mass, and walked down the road to meet the musicians coming to play for the dance. "How much do you get for playing?" he asked. They told him. It was a good deal of money, considered in terms of his own $100-a-year income, but he did not hesitate. "Here, I'll give you twice that sum," he said. "Now go home and forget the dance." There was great resentment when the would-be dancers learned what had happened, but a few people, having no other way to fill their time, drifted into the church to see what was going on there. The sermon, as usual, was what people needed to hear, and some of them heeded. The priest had driven in the first wedge in his campaign to separate the people from their evil way of life. His sermons, in which he assured the farmers that in making a practice of carting their hay on Sunday, they were carting their souls to hell, had some effect. But the priest was anxious for a quicker reaction, so, once again, he decided on the direct method. Each Sunday before Vespers he took to walking down the lanes which farmers might use on their way home from work. Although the men strongly opposed the new ideas he was trying to introduce, they now had great respect for Father Vianney, the man, and would rather not be caught by Father Vianney, the priest. One Sunday, when the Curé was going down the road, he saw coming toward him a wagon piled high with sheaves of grain. The weather had been good, and showed no signs of changing, so there was no excuse for the full day of Sunday work that the load represented. The driver of the wagon was not visible, but the priest recognized the horses as belonging to a wealthy farmer of the district. He seized their reins and brought them to a halt, then called the farmer by name. "Come out of there!" he cried. "From whom are you hiding?" The grain sheaves shifted, and from under the heap there crawled the red-faced, sheepish farmer. "Why did you cover yourself with the grain that way?" Father Vianney's large eyes flashed fire. I didn't want you to see me," the embarrassed man stuttered. "And did you think you were hiding from God, too? Did you think He couldn't see you under the grain? Does He not see everything you do?" The direct, powerful personality of the priest reached the conscience of the farmer. He, at least, would do no more unnecessary Sunday work. Life in the little French towns had, for centuries, been regulated by the bells of the village churches. The day's work started, paused at noon, and came to its close to the sound of the Angelus. The year after Father Vianney reached ours, he decided that the crazy structure which supported his bell should be replaced by a proper belfry. From his own pitifully small store of coins, he himself started the subscription list. The Viscount of Ars, who lived in Paris, was visiting his mother in the chateau outside the village when the first moves towards restoring the church were made. He was so impressed by what had already been accomplished by the new Curie that he joined his mother in generous donations of money and material. The church roof was repaired, little shrines were erected, and God's wardrobe, as the Curie called the vestments, was refurbished and enlarged. The Curie's own home was a peasant house built of clayey mud. Of the 2 rooms on the ground floor, kitchen and dining room, the stone-floored kitchen was used most. Father Vianney's own meals were frugal, almost non-existent, just as they had always been, but he kept food on hand to give the hungry passers-by, the homeless and neglected children. And while he fed their bodies, he instructed their minds in the hope of awakening their souls. Of the 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, the one nearest the church was his, although the few hours of sleep he permitted himself were more often than not taken on the bare floor with a piece of wood for his pillow. Most of his time was spent in working and praying, and, after Christ and his mother, the one to whom he prayed with the greatest faith was Saint Philomena. Not long before Father Bailey's death, there had been visiting in Ecouly a young woman named Pauline Jerichot, who later, we shall see, launched a great mission work. She, for good reason, had deep devotion to this young martyr. Miss Jerichot had told the two priests the story, not well known at the time, of the girl Philomena, who had died for her faith in the reign of the Emperor Diocletian. Miss Jerichot had been gravely ill some time before, so ill that doctors had given up all hope of her recovery. She had been carried, almost unconscious, to the shrine where Saint Philomena's relics were kept, and there had been miraculously cured. Quite naturally, she was eager to tell as many people as possible of the young saint's power in heaven. At once, Father Vianney had been greatly attracted to the dear little saint, as he called her, and he turned to her in all his perplexities. To Philomena he would say, when he instructed the children, nothing was refused. She loved God so much that when she was just a little girl she died for him, so of course he listens when she asks. He credited to her all the success he had in Ars. However, he never simply turned a problem over to her. He worked hard and asked for her help in the work, and the work continued successful. His one feat in stopping a Sunday dance did not, of course, end those pagan revels, but things began to be a little different. Several times when the crowd gathered, he walked over and stood quietly looking at the people, drinking and rioting, when they should have been in church. The deep, earnest eyes, burning in the sorrowful ascetic face, spoke the words his tongue did not. Many of the revelers went home, and the spirits of those who remained were dampened. This angered the tavern keepers. "We have built up a good business here," they growled. "What does he want to do, ruin us?" Father Vianney did not want to ruin anyone or anything except sin. He would have liked to see the disappearance of the places which contributed so much to the drunkenness and debauchery of Ars. And, bit by bit, he moved toward his goal. When he rebuilt and refurbished his little church, he had installed a new confessional. There he began to spend more and more of his time. His fame as a confessor and adviser was spreading. In his early days in Ars, there were but two people in the village itself on whom he could count for help in the church. One was Mrs. Bidvost, his housekeeper, who lived near the rectory, and the other a Miss Pignot, who boarded with her. These two women cleaned the church, dressed the altar, and tried between themselves to supply periods of daily adoration. This, of course, pleased the Curie, but he wanted more. He wanted church societies. One day a group of the giddiest girls in town had gathered in the village square, ready to start off on a round of drinking and dancing. Father Vianney saw them. "Here," he said to himself, "is my rosary confraternity ready-made. I'll go out and talk to them." He advanced to the green and greeted the girls pleasantly, pretending not to know what their plans were or where they were bound. "Come," he suggested, "let's go into church and say the rosary. We'll pray that whatever it is you're going to do, you will do well." The girls were upset and confused. To go into the church and pray was the thing furthest from their minds. Yet they did not know how to refuse this gentleman with the penetrating eyes. Each waited for someone else to laugh at the suggestion, to walk away. If one did, they all would, but no one had the courage. Against their will and wishes, compelled by a stronger personality than their own, they went rather sulkily into the church, knelt and prayed. There was silence when they finished. Then one of the girls spoke. "I'd like to go to confession, Father," she said timidly. "I would too," said another. And so he got the nucleus of the little band who would help in his war against evil. Through these girls, among others, it became known that Father Vianney told penitents what they needed to hear. He scolded some, comforted and encouraged others. Often when crowds were waiting outside his confessional, he would step out and select one far down in the line to come first. For he knew unfailingly when the effort to come had been hard, when the long wait might give Satan a chance to persuade the penitent to leave. and, strangely enough, no one ever protested when a latecomer was given precedence over those who had waited for hours. They were convinced that Father Vianney's decisions were inspired. When Pope Gregory XVI, impelled largely by the work of Pauline Jaricot, authorized the cult of Saint Philomena, the Curé of Ars at once built a little shrine in her honor at the side of the church. He was delighted when it became a center of pilgrimage. What he did not know, would not have believed, was that many of the people traveled to Ars only incidentally to visit the shrine. Their primary reason was to see, to talk with, to go to confession to Father Vianney. Now the town itself had changed, so much so that the 4 taverns functioned no longer as such. They were now small hotels for the convenience of the many pilgrims. The old Ars was no more. When Father Vianney had been Curé for 5 years, the bishop, amazed at all that had been accomplished, sent for him. The town of Salos was larger than Ars, the prelate said, but as much in need of conversion as Ars had been. Father Vianney therefore was to take it for his new parish, his new battlefield. The people of Ars were heartbroken and indignant. Father Vianney was theirs. Through him they had given up their old evil ways. Through him they had made their peace with God and received spiritual and material blessings. Although they knew their priest himself would do as he was told, they were less anxious to cooperate. "I'd like to strangle that vicar general," one young woman declared. "He must have told the bishop about the Curie. It's all his fault that we are losing our saint." "Hush," said her mother. "That's a dreadful thing to say. It is the will of God that our good Curie should leave us." "I don't believe it's God's will," insisted the girl, and it almost seemed as if she were right. The priest packed his few possessions and loaded them on a cart, ready to leave after Mass the following morning. But heavy torrents of rain fell that night, and the next day when the cart reached the little river over which they had to pass on the way out of Ars, it was so flooded that crossing was impossible. So Father Vianney went back to the town to wait for the flood to subside. The parishioners, having ascertained that the Curé did not really want to leave them, but was acting rather from obedience, started collecting signatures on a petition to the bishop asking that Father Vianney be left with them. The mother of the Viscount of Ars, the great lady of the chateau herself, headed the movement, and before they could present their request, Father Vianney packed up again to try to follow the bishop's orders. Again there was distress in the village, unhappiness that they had not moved faster in their efforts to keep their priest, dismay that all hope seemed gone. But again rain came, the river flooded, there was no crossing. This time there was no relaxation in Ars. They had had their hopes raised, dashed, and raised again. They felt unsure and insecure as they waited for word from the Vicar General in reply to their petition. But where, in the past, disappointment and worry would have meant cursing and drunkenness among many of the villagers, now they turned to prayer, to daily Mass, and to more frequent communion. The flooded river subsided again, and across it came a messenger from the bishop. Father Vianney was to stay with his people. Now, more than ever, the pastor was the beloved shepherd of his flock. Almost every home had a warm welcome for him. He was in touch with every facet of their lives. Their work, their health, their herds, their crops, all were of interest and importance to him. In time of joy, in sorrow or fear, the people turned to Father Vianney. The children, always his greatest care, knew that they had an unfailing friend in him. He planned a school for girls, where the future mothers of families could learn to read and write and figure, but, most important, learn of the love of God. Pilgrims came in great and greater numbers, and one dreadful visitor came. Chapter 8. In one of his earliest sermons in Ars, Father Vianney explained why he preached so bitterly against the evil in his parish, why he marshaled all his powers to do battle. He could never, he explained, but must speak out against it, even if in doing so he made the people hate him. Even if a priest were certain of being lynched when he came down from the pulpit, he said, That must never stop him from speaking out against wrong. Although by far the greater part of the parish were now leading holy, useful lives, the devil still had a few followers, who liked the old ways better. Many of the men now said their beads as they walked to and from their work, but among them were some almost insanely angry at the changes Father Vianney had made. They composed drunken, wicked songs about him, threw filth on his house and even on the church, and they wrote anonymous letters to the bishop, accusing the Curie of dreadful things. Some of the letters seemed well written and well reasoned, so the bishop thought it best to send one of his aides to examine Father Vianney, to inquire into his life and habits, and see if anything he did could really give rise to scandal. It was a grief and a humiliation for the Curé of Ars to be investigated in this way, but he answered humbly and simply all the questions, discussed all the problems, and the bishop's emissary went away convinced that he had talked with a very saintly man. But the devil, who had spoken through the scandal-bearing mouths of the angry villagers, was not giving up so easily. It had seemed, before Father Vianney's arrival, that a large part of the citizens of Ars were headed for damnation. Now, not only had most of them reformed their ways, but people from all parts of France were going to Ars to confess the sins of years to the Curie, to get help from him in living better lives. Hundreds of souls whom the devil had counted as surely his were slipping from his grasp. He would take direct action. For a while he taunted the Curie, tortured his mind. "You are not a good priest," he would whisper. "You are not doing God's work. If you ever hope to save your own soul, get out of here. Go to a monastery and spend the rest of your life in prayer." "You are not equal to the duties here," would come on another day. "You were stupid as a boy, and now you are a stupid man. Too stupid even to see what a failure you are." Poor Father Vianney was torn with anguish. Were those thoughts only temptations, he wondered, or was the truth at last forcing itself on him? He fasted more strictly than ever, and imposed severe penances on himself, praying all the while that he might know positively what he should do. The devil grew impatient. He couldn't worry the priest out, so he would frighten him away from the place where so many souls were being saved. The Curé had bought a house, which he was fixing up to be used as a school for girls. Here catechism would be taught. Here feet would be started on the road to heaven. The devil could not endure the thought. One night, as Father Vianney worked over plans for the school, he heard noises outside his door. There was something indefinably threatening about them, so the next morning he spoke to some of the young men of his parish. "I'm afraid some ruffians may be planning to break into the church," he explained. "Let us take turns watching, Father," one of the young men suggested. "We'll each take a night on guard duty, until we are sure no thieves are around, or until we catch them." The noises continued for 2 or 3 nights, but try as they would, the self-appointed guards could not see where they came from or who might be making them. Then came the turn of André Vertre, the young man who had originally proposed the night watch. After night prayers, the Curie and André left the church, entered the little house, and talked as they warmed themselves in front of the kitchen stove. They had been there some minutes when André shuddered. "Are you still cold?" asked the priest. "Can I heat up some milk to warm you?" "No, thank you, Father. I am not cold even though I shivered. I feel strange, somehow." The priest looked at him for a moment, saying nothing. "It's 10 o'clock," he broke the silence. "I'll give you my blessing and then we'll go to bed. I've not had much sleep lately," he added with a smile. The Curé went to his room and André to his, but hardly had young Vertre closed his door when there was a great pounding on the door leading to the churchyard. André seized his gun and ran downstairs, determined that whoever was disturbing Father Vianney's rest in this way would pay dearly for his fun. Before he was halfway down the stairs there was a rattling at the door latch, and from the other side of the house a banging as if someone were pounding on the wall with a wooden hammer. Then the house began to sway and tremble as if an earthquake were beginning. Andre Verture yelled to the priest, Father Vianney, come out quickly! There is an earthquake, and I think the house may collapse." The priest opened his door. "You have heard the noises, then?" he asked. "Of course I heard the noises. Why else would I have run out with my gun? But it's not the noises that I'm worried about. We're wasting time talking. Let's get out before the house falls in on us." "I don't think it will fall," said the priest soothingly. "See, the trembling has stopped. We'll go back to bed." The pounding and hammering as well as the tremors recurred at intervals all through the night. Neither the watcher indoors nor some others who had hidden outside were able to catch any sign of an intruder. After about 2 weeks of such doings, Father Vianney came to a decision. This attack on his rest and his nerves was not the work of hate-filled men. It was, the Curie felt certain, the work of Satan himself. Furious because so many souls he had counted as surely his were now, through Father Vianney, changing their ways and earning their salvation, the demon was striking. The priest realized that the attack was being made on him personally, and he would have to stand up to it alone. He thanked the guards and told them not to come any more. The confessions continued, conversions mounted, and Satan became wilder and wilder in his efforts to tire out or frighten away this priest who was the cause of it all. Sometimes, just as the weary Curie fell asleep, there would be a roar above his head, as if hundreds of mounted troops were galloping through the attic. Sometimes there would be shrieks and groans from inside the walls. Other nights a harsh, very loud voice would sing in the chimney of the fireplace in the Curie's bedroom. "What a very ugly voice old Scratch has," Father Vianney would say to himself. "If more people heard him, fewer might listen to what he says." Sometimes the racket would continue all night. Again it would stop suddenly, only to start up louder than ever as the weary priest dozed off. "Ha, Vianney," the rasping voice would sneer. "You can't sleep and you can't pray. I'll have you yet, Vianney." Those were the worst nights, the nights when the awful voice actually spoke to him, taunted him. But the devil was wrong in one thing. The Curie of Ars could and did pray unceasingly. The neighbors, of course, all became aware of what was going on in their beloved priest's home. They, too, prayed harder and longer than they ever had before. They were deeply distressed when the Curie would appear for Mass with face and hands bruised. This meant his enemy had thrown him from bed and dragged him across the floor. Satan was fighting fiercely. At this time Father Vianney's sister Marguerite came to visit him, knowing nothing of the torture her brother was enduring. After they had spent a pleasant evening together, the Curie went to his room and his sister to the guest room. She had just put out her candle when the pounding and hammering started. She rushed to the hall. "Jean-Marie, brother, come quickly! I am afraid!" Father Vianney ran from his room. "Has something disturbed you, sister?" he asked. "Yes, there was a terrible noise and something shook my bed. I had an awful sense of—" "Oh, that was only old Scratch," the Curie said consolingly. "However, he won't hurt you. He's after me. And he won't hurt me because God protects me." He paused for a moment, his eyes twinkling. "Do you know, Marguerite," he continued, "old Scratch is not half so clever as people think he is. He gives me signals he doesn't intend to. Whenever some soul in deep trouble is coming to see me, some hardened sinner, old Scratch is particularly anxious to hold on to. He makes an unusually dreadful din, gets especially violent in his acts. So I am prepared and can pray for strong guidance. No, old Scratch is not so smart." In spite of his parish duties, the growing number of confessions, the sleepless nights, Father Vianney found time and strength to continue the work on Providence, as he called his school for girls. To procure the house, he had used every cent he could beg or borrow. Now he had the house, but no money to operate it. But he had a much more valuable asset. He had faith. 2 girls of the parish were to run Providence, 2 girls he himself had taught and trained. And they, too, had faith. The first morning they entered the house, the only provisions they found were a pot of butter and a little dry cheese. "Shall we go home for dinner?" asked Benoit Lardette, who was in charge. "Let's wait," her assistant, Catherine Lausanne, suggested. "We are living in Providence, so let us see what Providence will provide." Very soon Benoit's little brother appeared at the door, carrying a basket covered with a white napkin. "Mother had a feeling you'd have no dinner," he explained, "so she cooked enough for you both and sent it over." The 2 girls looked at each other. Then they bowed their heads in prayer, grateful for this proof of God's care. We have already seen that the school had been planned as a place for the education of the girls of ours, but from the first it was so well run, had such a fine spirit, that soon parents from outlying farms and nearby villages sent their daughters to take advantage of the Christian training which Providence offered. Without at all intending it, the Curé of Ars found before long that he was running a boarding school for 16 girls outside his parish. The Emperor Napoleon had waged long wars, draining money and men from a country already poor in both. He had been defeated at Waterloo on 1815 and died 6 years later. But changes in government had made little change in the conditions of the population of France. Poverty laid cruel fingers on the people, and the people became cruel in turn. Boys were of help to their families. They could work and bring in a little money. Girls, on the other hand, were a care and expense, so they were sometimes lost or abandoned by their parents. If parents died, the boys they left behind might be adopted, but the girls rarely were. So the French countryside became accustomed to the sight of girls wandering around looking for a little work they might do in exchange for food and shelter. The people might become accustomed, but the Curé never. In 1827 he told his parishioners that he wanted to build a shelter next to the school where the homeless girls might be cared for. He drew up plans for the structure at night. His ears might ring and his head ache with the shattering din made by his enemy, the arch-fiend, but he prayed and worked and completed the drawings. Then he took up his adze and chipped stone. He mixed mortar and carried it. He did anything and everything to help speed the completion of the building. More than one fashionable lady or grand gentleman who had come out of curiosity to see the saint was startled when he was pointed out to them. For the man they saw was a shabby little workman staggering under the weight of a heavy beam or load of planking. "Why," the visitor would gasp, "I thought the famous Curé of Ars was a big man." "Big? A big man?" The guide's eyes would flash. "Sir, there is no bigger man in all France." In almost no time after the building was finished, the dormitories were full. New arrivals were never questioned about their faith, or even whether they had any. If they were homeless, hungry, they were admitted. There was no age limit. Abandoned babies, miserable girls in their teens, their need was their key of entry. The little money which Mr. and Mrs. Vianney bequeathed to their priest's son, he at once gave it to Providence. When it was gone, he started selling his furniture and his few possessions. He redoubled his prayers, spending much of the night in the shrine of Saint Philomena, his dear little saint to whom nothing is refused. But one day in 1829 it looked as if the end had come. There was only a handful of wheat left for the floor to make the orphans' bread, and there was no way of getting more. No one around who had not already given all the alms he possibly could. Catherine Lausanne went to the Curé. "What shall we do, Father?" she asked after she had told him of the situation. "Do? What do you mean?" Can we keep the orphans?" "Keep them? Of course we'll keep them." "But how can we when we have no food?" "You have no faith?" The Curé stole to the granary where the wheat, when there was any, was stored. Under the pitiful handful of grain he hid a relic of St. Francis Regis. Years before, when Jean-Marie had found learning impossible, and had feared he would never reach the priesthood, he had made a pilgrimage to Paris, to the tomb of the great missionary St. Francis Regis, to pray for aid in his studies. His prayer then had been answered. Now he called once again on the saint for help. The following morning, when Catherine and Benoit rose to wake their charges in time for Mass, they heard a creaking and groaning of timbers. "It sounds as if part of the building were getting ready to fall," said Catherine, white-faced with alarm. "We better hurry and get the children out." "Let's look first," suggested Benoit, "and see where the trouble is." They went to the cellar, but all was normal there. They inspected the stairway, but that too seemed secure. Bit by bit they went over the building, until at last they reached the granary. It was literally bulging with grain. The two young women fell to their knees to thank God. Some time later supplies once again were low. There was flour for 1 loaf of bread when 10 were needed. "Go and tell the Curé," suggested Benoit. The little girl who was helping in the kitchen was sent running to Father Vianney. He shook his head. "Don't worry so," he chided. "You seem to have no faith at all. Go back and say your prayers and make the bread." The girl went back and put the flour in the mixing trough. It looked like a tiny white island in the huge wooden bowl, and it was with great care that she dribbled in water. But the dough was still thick and needed more water, so she added more. When she began to knead it, however, it was still too heavy to be worked, so she added more water. The trough now seemed to have as much dough as was usual on baking days, so she let it rise, pounded it down, and let it rise again. From the flour for 1 scant loaf, she baked 10 20-pound loaves, all that the great oven would hold. The girls at Providence ate heartily, and said that the bread was even better than usual. They needed good food, for their days were busy ones. They learned to read and write and to figure a little. They worked in the garden, and since most of them would work either in other homes or in homes of their own, they were taught to sew and knit, to wash and iron, to spin and weave. But most of all, they learned to know and love God, to understand His commandments, and to keep them. The Girls of Providence orphanage began to be known for their sweetness and ability. When a mother needed help with her children, or a housekeeper required aid, it was to the school of the Curie of Ars that they turned. When the girls were old enough or well enough trained to leave the home, there was always a good position waiting for them. They were not permitted to leave until this was certain. They were never happy when the time for parting came, for Providence was a good and happy place, the only goodness and happiness many of them had ever known. But among their earliest lessons there they had learned obedience. So they went when the time came, and carried the results of their training with them as missionaries might. "We are the spoiled children of God," Father Vianney often told them with a smile. "When have we ever wanted anything? My children, always remember that you are constantly surrounded by the love of God. He is only waiting for you to call on it." The years went on. In 1830, the French seized Algiers. Greece broke away from Turkey and became independent again. Belgium separated from Holland, and the Polish struggle for independence began. All the world seemed in turmoil, but none of these things had any meaning for the Curie of Ars. 50, 60, 80 people a day were coming to the village to see the saint. The story of his works was spreading, to get his advice and consolation, to go to confession to him. The farm boy Jean-Marie Vianney had always loved the open air, had loved to watch the changing seasons, to walk in field and lane. Now from dawn to dusk he was shut up in an airless box, listening to stories of misspent lives, pouring himself out in advice and help. How long could he stand it? Chapter 9. Since he had first come to Ars, Father Vianney had never had a day, or even half a day, that was his own to do with as he liked. Now the pressure was much greater. He would go to church at 1 in the morning, or even at midnight, and hear confessions until Mass at 6 or 7 o'clock the next morning. Always awaiting him were long lines of people who had stood outside the church since the previous evening. After Mass he would return to the confessional until 11 o'clock, when he held his catechism class. At first the class had been for the children, both those who lived at Providence and those who came from the village and nearby farms. But adults, hearing of the helpful instructions the Curie gave, crowded around windows and doors trying to catch his words. "We will move the class to the church, where all can be seated," Father Vianney decided. But it was not long before the seats were all filled and people stood in the aisles and on the porch, and still there was not room. In the afternoon he was once again in the confessional, where he stayed until it was time for the rosary and benediction which closed the day. At 9, as a rule, he went home, with his office still to be read. The crowds grew larger, 60, 70, 100 people a day, then 200, 300, 400. 5 horse-drawn bus lines were now serving ours. The parish reached only by a cart track when Father Vianney became its Curie. The railroad, which stopped at the station of a nearby town, extended round-trip tickets to a week. This was because people often had to wait 3 or 4 days before their turn came to make their confessions to the Curé of Ars. The 4 hotels were always filled, private homes were opened, and through the summer farmers set aside special fields in which the pilgrims might sleep. Ars, which had drawn small crowds of noisy, drunken revelers in the old days, now drew vast armies of quiet, intent, and prayerful people. Sick people were cured at Saint Philomena's shrine. Suffering minds were eased by the Curie. Diseased souls were made well again. "Just to talk to him," the pilgrims would say. "If I can just talk to him, I know everything will be better for me." But to talk to him required hours of patient waiting. Day after day, week after week, month after month, Father Vianney heard the recital of the people's sins, reprimanded and advised the penitents. Of course, not all who came were sinners. There were the pious and good, too, who wanted counsel and direction for the betterment of their lives. One such, going into the sacristy where the Curie sometimes spoke with the people, saw a beautiful lady in blue talking to the priest. He had come upon the Curé of Ars getting help and wisdom from the Mother of God herself. In 1835, Father Vianney was making preparations to go away on his own concerns. As he bustled about checking on various details before leaving, his hair, snowy white although he was only 41, blew in the wind, and his cassock flapped around his hurrying legs. He had hoped for a long time to be able to make a retreat, and now he was arranging for a few days at his old seminary, where a group of his confreres were going for a time of spiritual reinvigoration. Before he could leave, of course, there were innumerable things to be done. He was happy in the thought that he would soon be having a few hours of recollection of the solitude which had been denied him for so long. He wanted help in deciding whether it was conscience or the devil which constantly whispered in his ear, "You are no good as a priest. You are falling in your tasks. You should resign from your parish and leave it to a priest who can really do the work." Torn as he always was, and would be to the end of his days, between his duty to God and his duty to man, the Curie had decided that the people of Ars could wait while he got the help he felt he needed. Monsignor Devi, who was in charge of the seminary, knew the sanctity of the Curie, knew of the immense and needed work for souls that he was doing, work the Curie could never properly evaluate himself because of his saintly humility. "You do not need a retreat," Monsignor Devi said firmly. "The people of Ars and those who come to Ars need you very badly. And I repeat, you do not need to be here. You are to go back, and now." Slowly and sadly, before the retreat had even begun, the Curie went back to his parish, back to the thousands of people who wanted his decisions and advice, to the long days and nights in the confessional. Again the days and weeks and months went by, and as they grew into years, an idea became more firmly fixed in Father Vianney's mind. Anyone, he felt in his humility, could do the work he was doing. To save his own soul, he was certain, he should live out the rest of his life in a monastery where he could spend his hours in prayer and meditation, making himself a better priest than he believed himself to be. He asked Monsignor Devi for permission to make the move, but was refused. He prayed very hard and asked again. Again he was refused. He pondered the 2 great commandments and trembled with fear that in obeying the second, love of neighbor, he was slighting the first, love of God. He was torn between his duty as parish priest and his desire for a life of prayer and penance, for he saw himself as a miserable sinner. God wants every man to save his soul, he told himself. I have been here a long time, but I do not feel as if I were making any progress on my own road to heaven, so I will leave and go to a monastery. These thoughts came only from the Cure's humility and his deep love of God, but the devil seemed to think differently. He seemed to think he had won. There were none of the rappings and bangings in the Cure's little house that night. Everything was quiet and the world was at rest. All the world, that is, except Father Vianney. He was excited, half a little boy running away from home, and half a man who had come to a grave decision and was going to act on it. His breviary, his rosary, and a few books of spiritual reading were packed in a small bundle with his clothing. He went quietly out of the house, and under the dark high dome of the sky, he walked down the lonely road. It chanced that he had finished hearing the confessions of all the waiting pilgrims that day, and the line had not formed outside the church in readiness for him to appear the next day, so there was no one to see his escape. He walked along the road, drawing clear air deep into his lungs, looking at the far-off stars and thinking of the Creator who hung them there and kept them in their courses. A trowel near the crossroads reminded him of the Holy Child's first crib. The stark arms of a dead tree, spread wide against the night glow, brought a sob from his throat as he thought of the God-man's last torturing bed. He fingered the rosary in his pocket, asking Christ's mother to bless him on his journey. His heart leaped in joy as he thought of days and nights when he could spend uninterrupted hours in prayer and contemplation. Then he could praise God and serve Him, could be sorry for his sins and the sins of the world. The sins of the world! As he looked around the fields now, he was aware of people sleeping on the ground. They were pilgrims on their way to Ars. Suppose there was one among them who was a real sinner, who had had to wrestle with himself to get this far, and if he went to Ars the next day, only to find that the man on whose help he counted was gone, he might well turn away and go back to his evil ways. The Curé kept walking, but his step was slower. A soft night breeze brushed down his face. Far off on some tree-hidden farm, a dog barked at the moon, which had just come above the horizon. Father Vianney smiled at this echo of a timeless feud. Then his face sobered again, as his mind went back to the rightness and justice of his escape from his parish. "Father, my husband died, and I am penniless. Father, the boys in my village say. Father, I can't seem to pray, and—" The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, voices of the pilgrims who travel long miles to see and talk with and listen to the Curé of Ars. Then he seemed to hear another voice asking him a question. "Hasn't God called you to serve Him as the parish priest of Ars?" A groan came from Father Vianney's throat. He knew the answer but did not want to admit it. He thought of the quiet, the lovely order of days in the monastery. He could pray there. He could praise God and adore Him. For a moment he stood in the sweet dark, the soft air. Then, sadly, determinedly, he turned around and trudged back to Ars. The crowd when he reached there had begun to form outside the church. Father Vianney slipped quietly into his house. When he went out to the confessional an hour or two later to start his 18-hour day, his serene, loving face gave no clue to the battle he had fought and won that night. Patient, gentle, stern when need be, he listened, and he said to each one just what that person needed to hear. One May evening, 3 years later, he collapsed while speaking in the pulpit. He had driven himself unmercifully, for years, had demanded from his frail body work that would have killed a giant. Now he had little reserve energy with which to fight the pneumonia which set in. For 9 days he hung suspended between life and death, between the heaven he longed for and the earth which gave him such a heavy task to fulfill. Then, while a priest friend was saying the Mass of Saint Philomena for the Cure's recovery, he turned the corner and was out of danger. But his recovery was long and hard, made harder because once again the longing for the silence and order of the cloister swept over him. The Viscount of Ars, who had been his friend for many years, came to call one day. He found the Curé sitting up in bed, his eyes filled with tears. The nobleman was frightened. "What is the matter? Are you in pain? I will call." "No, don't call anyone." The Curé was weak but decided. "It is just that I am longing for solitude. All my life, it seems, I have longed for solitude, and I've never had it." But as he grew a little stronger, he decided that he would have it. Forgetting his decision of 3 years ago, he determined to be rid of the weight of other people's problems and free to devote himself to prayer and penance. The Vicar General urged him to take the 2 weeks' vacation allowed to every priest in the diocese, to take longer if that was necessary to build up his strength again. A curate had come to share the work. The Curé listened and planned, but told no one of his decision. Now was his chance, he told himself, to leave Ars and the work which he was sure he was not doing well. In September, when he felt he had enough strength for walking, he once again stole out of his house in the darkness, carrying the little bundle of his worldly possessions. He planned to go to Lyons and seek refuge in a monastery there. He had not gone far when he heard footsteps behind him. "It is someone following me," Father Vianney decided, "someone who will want me to go back. But I won't. The bishop has sent me a curate, and a young, strong man can do better work than I. I'll hurry a little." But the footsteps behind him speeded up too, and several voices spoke in the dark. "Father Vianney, I need to consult you. Father Vianney, will you bless this rosary? Father Vianney, will you advise me?" The Curé ignored them, walking along as rapidly as he could, determined on getting to the heaven he longed for. The pilgrims followed a little longer, and then began dropping back, unsure of how to act in this unexpected situation. One young man stayed with the Curé, suspecting his plans, but anxious to serve. "I am not asking you to stay, Father Vianney, but let me go with you to carry your bundle. That is all I ask." They walked through the night, saying the rosary together. Then thin dawn came, lighting the highway. Father Vianney was disturbed. "If we keep to the road, we will surely meet carriages bringing people to Ars," he said to his companion, "and pilgrims on foot use this road too. They may recognize me." The young man agreed that they undoubtedly would. "Then we must cut across country. We'll go through these woods. They'll bring us out to a lane leading to a back road." Walking on the highway taxed the strength of the priest, who had not yet fully recovered from his illness, but the route he now took in his flight was hard even for his young companion. Briars caught at their clothing, and branches raked their faces and hands. They slipped unwarily into holes covered by the carpet of leaves on the ground. Sharp roots cut first one of Father Vianney's shoes, and then the other, but he trudged on. He was away from Ars now, and would continue his journey. The sun climbed the heavens, seemed to pause overhead for a moment, then began its descent. The Curé was moving even more slowly now, but still he kept walking. It was dark when they reached Dardaly, the town of Father Vianney's birth. "Why, this is only 20 miles from Ars," the young man said to himself. "I could have come here and back in the 18 hours we have been walking." He looked at the frail man beside him. The priest's feet were torn and bleeding, and his breath came in painful, tearing gasps. It did not seem possible that the thin, almost emaciated body could be forced to go farther. "And now, Father Vianney?" he asked. My brother Fencos. His home is near. I will go there and rest a little before I continue on my way to Lyons. You rest a little too before you go back to ours. We have come a long way, and thank you for accompanying me." The Curé needed more than a little rest. Sick and utterly exhausted, he was at once put to bed. His companion went back to Ars, and Ars filled with consternation at the loss of its saint. It was on the 12th of September that Father Vianney left Ars. On the 13th a letter arrived from the Countess in the chateau outside the village, asking if there was anything she could do that would convince him he should return. On the 14th the mayor of Ars wrote to Dardilly, and at Francos's home asked to be shown into the little first-floor room where he had been told the Curé lay. "He is not there," Francos's wife said. "Gone again?" the mayor exclaimed. "May I write a note to leave for him, in case he returns?" Mrs. Vianney nodded permission, not explaining that she had simply moved her exhausted brother-in-law upstairs, where he might be undisturbed. "I need not tell you, my dear Curé, all the sorrow I feel at not finding you here," the letter began. "I came with a great desire to see you and to get your blessing once more," he continued, reminding the Curé of how much good Providence was doing, and of how completely it depended on Father Vianney's guidance for its operation. He spoke of the holy souls which you are guiding to heaven, and of those who were far off whom you are leading home. "You need rest," the letter went on, "as no one knows better than I. Stay with your brother as long as is necessary for you, but do not forget your poor parish of Ars." He left the letter to be delivered. It was followed shortly by one from a hotel keeper in Ars, who in the old days had owned one of the crude taverns. "Father Vianney," the man wrote, "I hasten to implore you not to desert us. You know what I have said, and I repeat it now from the bottom of my heart. If there is anything which you disapprove of in my house, I would change it according to your wishes." On the 16th of September, Father Raymond, who had been the Curé's assistant in Ars, went to the bishop to ask what he should do. Receiving instructions, he proceeded on to Dardilly. He found the streets filled with pilgrims who had learned where Father Vianney was and had left Ars to seek him out. Father Raymond reported the bishop's directions to Father Vianney. He was not to stay in Dardilly because it was not his own diocese. However, if he really felt he must leave Ars, there were 2 other parishes to which he might go. "Come, Father Vianney," said Father Raymond, "suppose we go and look at the places you are offered." "Yes, I'd better leave here anyway," agreed the Curé. "These crowds are making life quite difficult for my brother and his wife." Quietly and unobserved by the waiting crowd of pilgrims, the 2 priests slipped out of the house and began their walk to Beaumont, one of the places the bishop had mentioned. The Curé was still far from strong, and as he went along he supported himself on a staff. Father Raymond was worried. It did not seem to him that the older priest could possibly make the trip afoot. Yet they put the miles behind them. When they came to a little town with a chapel, Father Raymond thought it would be a good place to rest. "Instead of reading our office by the wayside," he suggested, "let us stop here and do so." Father Vianney, his voice almost gone since his last illness, nodded. The 2 entered the chapel, went to one of the front pews, and knelt. Father Raymond finished reading first. He raised his head and looked about him and saw, to his amazement, that almost every seat in the church was filled. It was as if people had been summoned by a bell. "Father," he whispered, "all the people from miles around seem to have learned that you are here. I know that you have not the voice to speak to them, but at least give them your blessing." The Curé closed his breviary and looked at the crowd. They had come to hear him speak, and, warrior in God's cause that he was, he would not disappoint them. "I will speak to them," he said simply. He went to the front of the church and spoke. And though to the people nearest him his voice was weak, his words were understandable. Moreover, those in the back of the church heard him equally well. The Curé finished his talk, gave the congregation his blessing, and the 2 priests started off again. They reached Beaumont that night. The next morning each said his Mass and made his thanksgiving. As they rose from their knees, the Curé leaned toward Father Raymond to whisper in his ear. "Let us return to ours," he said. Chapter 10. No general coming home victorious from the wars, no king returning to his kingdom after a long absence, ever was more royally received than Father Vianney at Ars. The parish, at 5 in the afternoon, lay under a pall of sorrow and loss. A few minutes after 5, the church bells pealed out, the agreed signal if the beloved priest should return. "He is coming! The Curie is coming!" Men threshing wheat left the threshing floor and ran down the road in the hope that they might be the first to see him. Boys helping their fathers in the fields were told to unhitch the horse from the plow and ride to the neighbors with the good news. Women left their baking and cooking, and children ran from their games to pull the Cure's cassock and kiss his hands as he passed. They did not notice, as their elders did, that it was with great difficulty that he dragged himself along. In spite of the pang they felt at the sight of his weakness, the people could not help crowding around him, touching his clothing, assuring themselves that their saint, whom they had feared lost to them, was really back. Some of the men cleared a path for him, so that the exuberant people would not sweep him off his feet. "It was the Blessed Mother who told me to come back," he whispered to Father Raymond. "I thank her, for now there is joy in my heart, and I am at peace." For 10 years more the Curé of Ars continued his work, fighting to win souls for Christ, to help those who were already good to be better. At night the attacks of the furious adversary continued, sometimes subsiding for a day or a week, only to be renewed with redoubled violence. Several times during one night he might be thrown against wall or floor, but always he would arise, shaken but fighting Old Scratch with the powerful weapon of prayer. France had been torn by a dual conflict, with foreign countries and within her own boundaries. Monarchy had been restored for a short time, with Louis Philippe on the throne. But again in February 1848 the country endured a revolution. The king abdicated, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the emperor, was elected President of France. There was revolt in Sicily, in Austria, in Poland. In fact, in all Europe there was not a single country which could claim internal peace. Many people believe that this was the beginning of the abomination of desolation spoken of in Scripture, with nation warring against nation, and brother against brother. 1,000 people a day were leaving Europe to seek shelter in the United States. But the states themselves were shaken by dissension on the question of slavery, a problem and quarrel which daily grew more threatening. These world upheavals, however, were unknown to or unnoted by the Curé of Ars. His difficulties were more immediate: the fight for souls who came to him for help, the fight against the once more growing desire to enter a monastery. In 1853 he made his last attempt, and he defeated himself. Wise with inspired wisdom when counseling others, he was so guileless that he was unable to make or keep secret any plans which concerned him. To Catherine Lozane, who was in charge of Providence, he told his scheme, and discussed the running of the orphanage when he should be gone. "I will walk to Lyons," he said. "I have a brother-in-law there, and I know he will lend me a carriage in which I can ride to the monastery of La Neilière, and there I will spend the rest of my days." If it occurred to Catherine that it would be wiser and more expeditious to drive directly from Ars, she did not say so. But she did tell her assistant, Marie Filiat, that the man they thought of as their saint was leaving them. The assistant told some of her neighbors. They told some of the pilgrims. Someone told the assistant pastor. The Curé set out at midnight on his third effort to reach the life he yearned for, a life in which he felt he could serve God much better than he believed he was doing in Ars. He was now almost 60 years old. His step was even slower than it had been when he last fled. But there was just as much hope in his heart, just as much iron in the will which kept him pushing along. The houses along the deserted village streets were all closed. His rosary was his only companion. Walking was painful, now. The nights, which in earlier times he had spent sleeping on the cold, damp floor, had given him rheumatism, which tortured him as he plodded along. But his goal, a place of silence and contemplation, seemed so beautiful that the pains of his body were forgotten in the delight of his soul. He plodded on toward the small stream which marked the edge of the town. Twice when he had been told to leave Ars, it was this little stream, flooding over the footbridge, which prevented his departure. He neared that footbridge now. Again it was covered, but not with water. His assistant was there, and the mayor of Ars. People from the village were there, and a few pilgrims. He stopped, aghast. "You cannot stop me," he cried in a wavering voice. "You cannot prevent me from going. I will, because I must." As he spoke, the church bell of Ars rang in alarm. Pilgrims, wondering what the trouble was, rushed out of the houses where they slept, and began converging on the place where they saw the glow of lanterns and heard the sound of many voices. When they learned what was going on, they set up a loud cry. "You can't leave us! We need you! We have traveled miles and miles to get your fatherly counsel. You can't leave us orphans!" There were tears from men and women alike. There was sorrow and there was fright. How would they gain heaven, the people thought, if they lost the man on whom they depended to guide them? Bowed with the heavy weight of his strenuous years, Father Vianney stood among them, pitifully thin and worn. His hours in the confessional had carved deep lines of grief into his face, though they had left his mouth firmly tender. Light from the lantern carried by the mayor made a halo of his hair, while his brooding eyes seemed to disappear in the shadow of their sockets. A silence fell on the group. No bird stirred in the tree-tops. No animal moved in the underbrush to show fear at this midnight invasion. Even the little stream passed over the rocks without a murmur. Nature, as well as man, seemed hushed and waiting. An expression of physical pain twisted the Cure's face, and he groaned as if he had been shown a cross beyond his strength to carry. He looked around him. There was the girl whose reputation had been bad when he came to Ars. Now she was a fine Catholic wife and mother. Over there was one of the men who had always worked on Sunday in the past. Now neither he nor his family ever missed Mass on Sunday and rarely on weekdays. Among the pilgrims was a couple who, his heaven-prompted intuition told him, were gravely in need of warning and advice. Father Vianney looked across the stream toward the path on the other side, the path which led to solitude. The knuckles of his twisted hand whitened as the rheumatic fingers tightened on his staff. His lips moved in prayer. Then slowly and sadly he turned, saying no word, and walked back to Ars, followed by equally silent men and women. When they reached the church, the Curé went into the sacristy and put on his stole. Then he seated himself in the confessional. His dream of solitude and quiet contemplation was over. Not long after Father Vianney had made his last act of renunciation, had resigned himself to living and dying in Ars, the bishop arrived for a visit. By now the Curé was involved in many things: Providence, a school for boys, work for the propagation of the Faith Society which Pauline Jaricot had founded, and numerous other projects. He was always in need of money, and it crossed his mind to wonder if the bishop had come to inspect his books. The Curé started to make a speech of welcome. Smiling, the bishop waved him to silence. "I have something for you, Father Vianney," he said. He held out a mozzetta, a short cape with a hood which is worn by certain church officials. This one was decorated with a band of purple silk and 2 bands of ermine, the insignia of a canon, one of the special dignitaries of the church. Father Vianney was appalled. "Oh, no, no, please, give it to my assistant. It will look much better on him." A little crowd had gathered on the arrival of the bishop, and they were all amused at the shock in the Cure's voice. "It is for you," the bishop said firmly, putting the cape around Father Vianney's shoulders and buttoning the top button. That accomplished, he entered the church intoning the Veni Creator. Behind him walked the Vicar General, quite accustomed to ceremonial. Father Raymond was next, happy in the honor which had come to the Curie. A little procession of villagers and pilgrims brought up in the rear, and beside the bishop moved Father Vianney, looking for all the world like a man being led to his execution. Honors, he felt, would only add to his burden. Somehow he managed to get through the ceremonies. Somehow he acted as host to his distinguished guests of the little party which neighbor women hastily prepared. Somehow he stammered thanks for the honor and saw his guests depart. Then he hastily removed the cape, folded it, and put it away before he took up his duties again. The drain on his finances had grown as he reached out constantly in new directions. He sold the books in his library, his extra cassocks, his towels and handkerchiefs. His orphanage and the boys' school were fairly well established now, but there was the whole world needing missionaries, and he wanted to help in sending them forth. He also wanted to bring more mission preachers here into Ars. One morning he had an idea which delighted him. He carefully studied the beautiful cape the bishop had given him. "I shouldn't wonder if I could make quite a bit of money for my missions with that," he thought happily. With the silken ermine over the dusty arm of his worn old cassock, he trotted off to the home of Marie Richetier, an unmarried woman of some means. She had always been generous to the church, and had brought as souvenirs of the saint a good many of the things he had sold. "Would you like to buy this cape?" asked Father Vianney as he entered the house. "That Mosetta? Surely you aren't going to sell that? The bishop himself gave it to you. I think he will be hurt." "Not at all," the Curé interrupted. "He made the gift to give me pleasure, and I will take that pleasure in the form of cash for my missions." Mr. Couture was confused. If the Curé was determined to sell the cape, she would like to have it. On the other hand, should she not try to dissuade him from taking a step which seemed to her ill-advised? "Don't you think you should keep the cape, Father Vianney, if we have distinguished visitors?" "But the one in the tabernacle, surely, is the most distinguished. Who could ever come that we might compare with him? And he has seen me, and helped me, for years in my old cassock, with no fur and satin on top. Come, do you want to buy it?" Mr. Couture still hesitated. "Do you know what it is worth? I have no idea what to offer." "I have no idea what it costs," protested the bishop. "Suppose we say 15 francs. "It's worth more than that, I'm sure." "Suppose we say 20 francs, then," beamed the Curé, happy at doing so well for his beloved charities. "I'll give you 25 francs, decided Mr. Couture, although I am not at all sure that is enough." "Yes, I'm certain that is a fair price," said the Curé, rising. "And now I'll write to the bishop and tell him about my luck. I'll have enough now to bring some mission priests to Ars. They can preach and do the good that I, in my stupidity, must leave undone." With joy in his heart, Father Vianney sat down to compose the letter to his bishop. "Your lordship," he wrote, "the cape which you had the charity to give me has afforded me great pleasure. Since I had not quite all the money I needed to bring a mission to the parish, I sold the cape for 25 francs. He had, however, to rewrite the letter before sending it. Mr. Couture, troubled by doubt as to whether she had paid enough for the cape, went to the convent of the nuns who had made it. They told her it had cost 50 francs, so she hurried to the Curé and gave him another 25. Father Vianney, therefore, changed the letter to read, "I sold the cape for 50 francs. I am pleased with this price." It never even occurred to him to wonder if the bishop was pleased too. When 2 years later he was appointed a member of the Legion of Honor of France, his reaction was much the same. In 1852, France, once again shifting her form of government, had become an empire, and President Napoleon was proclaimed Emperor of the French. The following year was an uneasy one, marked by plots against the emperor, attempts on his life, and a general seething disquiet among the people. But in 1854, France settled not only her own internal affairs, but most of her difficulties with other nations. Planning began for a big industrial exposition to open in Paris in 1855 on the Emperor's birthday. Several people of importance had written to the Minister of State to suggest that France would honor herself by honoring the Curé of Ars. The writers pointed out the sanctity of the humble priest, the work he had done for humanity, calling him a second St. Vincent de Paul. On August 11th, therefore, the Medal of the Legion of Honor was awarded him. As was usual in such cases, the bishop was formally notified first. "You will take the Legion medal to him?" the vicar general asked the bishop. "No, I think not. He doesn't much value what I bring him," replied the bishop with a smile. "Someone close to him should bring it," the vicar general mused. "How about his new assistant? Since the men see each other daily, the Curé would not be so likely to dispose of the medal." "Good. We will notify Father Tocanier that the pastor to whom he has been assigned is to receive the medal of the Legion of Honor from his hands." The young priest was excited by the honor which had come to his Curie, and pleased that he had been chosen to make the presentation. He spent several hours composing and memorizing a graceful little speech for the occasion. At noon, the priest, several of the brothers who taught in the boys' school, the 2 women who had helped establish Providence, and a few other old friends went to Father Vianney's house. They knocked, entered, and stood beaming, waiting for the presentation. But the young priest, in the excitement of the moment, completely forgot the words he had prepared. "Here," he said, shoving out the precious red-sealed packet, "they've sent you something. Maybe some relics, or—" Father Vianney took the package quickly and opened it. His face fell. "It's only this," he said, holding up Francis' most coveted award. "The Medal of the Legion of Honor!" Catherine Latane exclaimed, sensing that the Curé did not quite understand what it was he held. "Put it on," suggested one of the brothers. "Why?" asked the Curé. "What is it?" "At least bless it," said another brother. The Curé agreed to that. "Do wear it, Father Vianney," urged Catherine Latane. "The people will be so pleased to see it." "I have worked among them for many years with no decoration pinned on me," the Curé protested. He turned to Father Tocanier. "You may have this," he said. "Show it to anyone who wants to look at it. It's yours to do with as you like. I have no use for it." And he went upstairs to read his office. With the growing fame of Ars as a place of pilgrimage, its Curé had been forced to change many of his habits. As a boy in Ecoli, he had given himself the lifelong penance of never eating anything he liked. As a pastor, he had formed the custom of boiling a pot of potatoes once a week, and eating a few of them cold each day for his single meal, scraping off the mold as the end of the week neared. But as his hours in the confessional grew even longer, he couldn't even take the time to boil the potatoes, so he asked the women at Providence to prepare a small bowl of soup for him each day. He had, too, to listen to praise and compliment which disturbed him. Once, when a distinguished visitor pointed out that he, the Curé of Ars, was the first and only honorary canon appointed by the bishop, Father Vianney snorted. "I don't wonder," he said sharply. "He was unlucky in his first choice, and seeing what a mistake he had made, he didn't want to risk doing it again." Chapter 11. As the years passed, the Curé of Ars became still more active in helping missions and charitable projects, anything and everything which would spread knowledge of God and of His love. The generosity and lack of self-interest which long ago had deprived him of his first new stute in Ecoli often impelled him now to give away money which he should have saved for his personal use. Pilgrims coming to Ars often brought substantial gifts of money to the Curé, money which he seldom held on to long enough to pay his debts. One day, when he found himself especially pressed for cash, although he had received a good deal in the course of the week, he worked out a plan which he hoped would protect him from himself. He called to him a Mrs. Reynard, who helped around the church and made herself useful in straightening out his tangled finances. "Claudine," he told her, "I want you to take on a new duty." I will be very glad to, Father, if you think I can do whatever it is. You can. All you need to do is to be very strict. Each day, the Curie went on, I'll empty my pockets and you will take charge of whatever comes out. You are to take good care of the money. And, above all, be on your guard against the Curie of ours. If he comes asking for any of it, refuse him point blank. Every day from that time on, the Curie would give all the cash she had to Mrs. Renard, who promptly put it in a strong box. So obedient was she to his directions that its inaccessibility often chagrined the Curie when he was unable to give to a person or a charity which appealed to him. Self-denial, of course, was the stuff of which Father Vianney's life was made, and had been for many years. He had long ago imposed on himself the rule never to smell a flower, never to drink when particularly thirsty, never to brush away a fly, never to express disgust at any unpleasant sight or smell, never to complain of discomfort. All his life, even as a boy, he had disliked and suffered from the cold. Yet as a man he refused to do anything to protect himself from it. Once when, after sitting for hours in the confessional, he started to leave, he fell heavily to the floor. Both feet had become numb and dead with the cold. When his distressed parishioners picked him up and would have called a doctor, he held up his thin hand to stop them. "I don't need a doctor," he twinkled. "All I need is a little more caution. After this, on cold days, I'll touch my feet and be sure they are there before I try to walk on them." Privately he told his assistant that night, "I have what I asked for. Long ago I promised God that, if he would let me convert ours, I'd never complain of any suffering he might send me." The assistant priest remained silent for some time, pondering this strange, gentle man, whose speech was often stumbling and ungrammatical, but who spoke always with such wisdom and assurance that people now flocked from all France, indeed from all Europe, to listen to him. "Who was your master in theology?" the young priest finally asked. "I had the same master as St. Peter," replied the Curé simply. There was another pause. The assistant heard the answer, but it was so frank and childlike that it was hard to understand. Yet, now that he and Father Vianney had a few moments together, he wanted to learn more of what made the Curé so great, and, if he could, to adopt some of his way of life. "How do you manage to do so much for God?" he asked. Please don't speak that way. I do nothing, and God does so much for me. But this I have learned, and I learned it from the shepherds who are in the fields in the winter time. They build a fire and draw near it for warmth, but from time to time they run about collecting wood to keep the blaze alive. Like them, we must learn how to keep the fire of the love of God alive in our hearts. We must feed the flame with prayer and good works." The Curé stopped speaking. It was plain that he was very tired. The wonder was that he was still alive. A man near 70, who still spent 12 or 14 hours a day in the confessional, a man who had passed decades of his life in physical rigors and spiritual battles, enduring at the same time unequal persecution from Satan himself. Nor, with increase of years, was there any let-up in the demands upon him. Rather, he was called upon more and more frequently for advice by fellow priests and dignitaries of the Church. Whether or not he was still haunted by his old longing to go to a monastery, where he might live out his life in quiet solitude and prayer, no one knew. He no longer spoke of it. The long, strength-consuming years, and now a racking cough, which had held on for a very long time, had made the Curé almost voiceless. Yet 200, 300, 400 people a day flocked to ours to hear Father Vianney speak, to go to confession to him, to get his advice, and his fighting heart would not let go while people needed him. One day in 1858 a priest asked him a question. "Father, if God gave you the choice between going to heaven at once or going on working as you do for the conversion of sinners, which would you choose?" "I'd stay." "But in heaven the saints are so happy. No more troubles, no more temptations." "Yes, the saints are happy enough," said the Curé slowly. Then his deep-set eyes began to twinkle. "But they're capitalists. They worked well, of course, because God punishes idleness and only rewards hard work. God loves them and hears when they intercede for us, but they can no longer win souls for Him by labor and suffering as we can." The priest considered that for a moment. "Well, if God were to leave you here below until the end of the world, you'd have all the time you wanted in front of you. Tell me, would you still get up so early?" The Curé smiled. "Yes, indeed. I'm not afraid of a little tiredness. I should still be the happiest of priests if it weren't for the thought that I shall have to answer for my priestly responsibilities before the judgment seat of God." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He had such a high regard for the priesthood, its privileges and duties, and was so sure he was failing in his task. For almost 40 years now he had worked up to 18 hours a day. 2 or 3 ounces of food daily had been his nourishment. Yet he felt that there was so much more to be done, so much greater effort to be expended, so much fiercer a fight for souls to be waged. In August of 1858, a priest from a neighboring town called on Father Vianney. Apologizing for his disheveled appearance, the visitor told how he had narrowly escaped injury when his horses shied and threw the carriage into a ditch. "St. Anthony never let anything like that happen to him," observed the Curé gently. "How did he prevent it?" asked the astonished priest. "He always traveled on foot," explained Father Vianney with a little smile. The abashed visitor hesitated, then went on to the problem which he had come to discuss. As always, Father Vianney told him what he needed to hear, and he rose to go, enlightened and comforted. "And may I come back next August, Father, to tell you how matters have progressed?" The Curé thought for a moment. Then his pain-etched face broke into its ineffably sweet smile. "No, Father, because I shall die early in August of next year." The sure knowledge that he had but a year to live spurred the Curé to even greater efforts. He tried to spend more time with the children of the village who had always been his particular love and care. They flocked around him, touching his clothing, clinging to his fingers, loving him. Even the most boisterous of the lads grew soft-spoken and gentle in manners when they drew near him. They seemed to sense that the beloved frail old man would not be with them much longer. But physically frail though he might be, his mind and soul were still indomitable. He was still God's warrior, fighting to help sinners save themselves. One evening, when Father Vianney was preparing to leave after a long day in the confessional, a man came into the sacristy. Tall, well-dressed, he was obviously a person of means and of importance. "Good evening," said the weary priest. He turned back to the confessional, beckoning the man to follow. "Good evening," answered the stranger. Then he went on, "I have not come to go to confession. I have come to reason and argue with you." The Curé paused. "Oh, my friend, you have made a great mistake. I am not a reasoner or an argufier. But if you are in need of consolation, and I think you are, kneel there." His finger, thin almost to emaciation, pointed to the prie-dieu where penitents knelt. "Be sure that others have done so before you," the Curé went on, "and none have been sorry." The man snorted. "I have already told you, Father Vianney, that I have not come for confession, and for a very good reason. I do not believe in confession. I do not believe in anything. I have no faith. Oh, I used to have, but I am wiser now." The Curé of Ars was aghast. "No faith? My dear man, how I pity you! You are wiser, you say? Why, a child of 8 who has learned his catechism knows more than you do." The man who had come to argue with a simple country priest became angry. He, an important person, in his own mind at any rate, had intended to reason with the Curé, to explain to him the stupidity of his beliefs. But the Curé was not listening humbly as his would-be instructor felt he should. "You say you have no faith," the priest went on. "You are wrong. You do. I'll be insistent with you, as I shouldn't have been if you had not spoken so foolishly. Kneel down and I'll hear your confession." "But Father Vianney, this is ridiculous. You are asking me to act in a comedy with you, and I am no comedian." The stranger's voice shook with rage, and his eyes were filled with fury as he looked at the frail priest. The priest looked back in silence. The stranger's eyes dropped. "Kneel there." There was a mingled sweetness and authority in the Cure's voice. Seemingly in spite of himself, the man fell to his knees. He made an unsure and trembling sign of the cross, and stumblingly began to accuse himself of his faults. The Curé of Ars gave absolution and went to the rectory where visitors awaited him. The stranger went into the church. His former arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a strange peace. "What a man he is!" he murmured as he slipped into a pew and knelt on the hard foot bench. "What a man! No one ever spoke to me in that way before. If he had not taken hold of me in just the way he did, who knows when I would have made my confession? I might have died without—" The self-important man without faith bowed his head and wept. Pastors from nearby villages had, for some years past, brought their first communion classes to the Curé of Ars for instruction, a duty and privilege which had always delighted Father Vianney. This year it seemed to some of the adults observing him that he was even more eager, that his eyes burned more brightly, as he watched the boys and girls preparing for the great day of their lives. In the spring of 1859, an old friend of the Curé went to Ars, and, not having seen him for some time past, was shocked at the extent to which he had failed. "I learned that for a long time past," he wrote to a friend, "Father Vianney had seemed to sustain by the breath of life." The little thread of voice left to him could be heard only by a very attentive ear. All the energy of his life and mind seemed concentrated in his eyes, which burned like two brilliant stars in their deep recesses, betokening strength and weakness, life and death. The old warrior knew that his fighting days were drawing to a close, that it would soon be time for him to leave the church militant. But as long as he remained on earth, he would not retire from the lists. The world was in a disturbed condition. In the United States, the question of slavery was increasingly agitating the people. France was once again at war with Austria. In June of 1859, a heat wave began, spreading from California to mid-Europe, sapping the strength of healthy people, ending the lives of those already ill. All June it continued, and on into July. Ars was damp and stifling, but the pilgrims continued to come, hundreds each day, and the Curé continued to hear confessions. From 1 o'clock in the morning, through the cruel heat of an unbelievably long day, he remained at his post. It was a slow and painful martyrdom. The sharp cough which had plagued him for 25 years was more tearing and incessant than ever. Several times he fainted, but always swore to secrecy anyone who might have been near when he fell. He talked at more frequent intervals of Philomena, his dear little saint, and even admitted to Father Tolkenier that God had permitted her, on occasion, to come down from heaven to advise him. The heat grew greater and more stifling. Each morning the sun would go down in an angry-looking mass of flames. Each morning it arose, sullen and burning. On the 29th of July, the Curé put in his usual 17-hour day. Finally he said his night prayers at the shrine of Saint Philomena, and returning to his house, sank into a chair. "I can do no more," he gasped. Chapter 12. The church bell rang at midnight, the hour at which the Curé of Ars always arose to start his day. But this time he made no move. Finally he was able to call out, and Catherine Zane, who had worked with him for many years, hurried in from an ante-room where she was waiting. "My humble end has come." The words were barely audible. "You must get my confessor, Father Beule." "I'll get the doctor, too." "It would be a waste of time," whispered the Curé. "He wouldn't be able to do anything for me, so don't disturb him." Father Tolkenier reached the Curé's room just after Catherine left on her errand. "Father Vianney," he said, "Saint Philomena cured you 16 years ago, and I'm sure she'll cure you now." "Saint Philomena won't be able to do anything this time." The pilgrims couldn't believe the news. The Curé of Ars, whom they had traveled so many miles to see, could not see them. For a while they were stunned. Then, forgetting their own troubles, disregarding the problems they had come to discuss, they began storming heaven with prayers for the gentle martyr inside the little house. The heat continued. Pilgrims vied with parishioners for the privilege of standing on the roof of the Cure's house in the killing sun and pouring water on roof and walls in the hope of cooling the rooms a little. Night and day there was no end to the prayers, the pleading that heaven would leave a little longer in Ars the Curé they loved and needed. The evening of Tuesday, August 1st, the Curé asked that on the following day he be given the last sacraments. As Father Bew came with the sacred host, the streets were lined with kneeling people. "How good God is," whispered Father Vianney. "When you can't go to Him any more, He comes to you." Tears streamed down the old man's face. "Is the pain worse?" asked the priest at his bedside. "Is that why you cry?" "No, I cry because it is so sad to receive communion for the last time," said the Curé. Priests from various parishes of the diocese streamed in to pray at the bedside of the dying man and to say Mass for him in the little church where he had served. Parishioners and pilgrims stood in the hall outside the door of the room where he lay, and, at intervals, he would feebly raise his hand to bless them. The Bishop of Belley hurried to Ars, and passing through streets crowded with praying people, hurried to the Cure's bedside. He reached it shortly after midnight. Throughout France, prayers were being said for Jean-Marie Vianney. In his room, at 2 in the morning, a priest was reading aloud the prayers for the dying. He reached the words, "May the angels of God come to meet him and lead him into the heavenly Jerusalem." Father Vianney smiled and died. The church bells tolled, but the people could not believe their message. He was near death before and was restored by a miracle. It is a miracle that he survived 40 years of the life he set himself. He is so much needed, so much wanted. What will become of us? We have counted on him to cure our sicknesses of body and soul. No one could believe that the Curé of Ars was gone, that their living link with heaven was snapped. But someone at last gave the reminder, "He has been our friend on earth. He will continue to be our friend in heaven." The light, thin body of the dead priest was carried downstairs and laid in state in one of the rooms. The venerable face, calm and benign, was left uncovered. A barrier was erected around the bier, and 2 of the brothers who taught in Father Vianney's school kept watch. Their arms grew weary passing backward and forward the crucifixes, rosaries, medals brought by the crowds to be touched to the hands which never again would be raised in blessing. Before dawn on Saturday, people began flocking in from all directions to pay their last respects to the greatly loved Curé of Ars. 300 priests were there, and at least 6,000 people. Father Vianney, who had all his life avoided pomp and praise, could no longer control what went on. The Vianney family and the church dignitaries filled the little church building. Outside, the people knelt on the bare ground through the solemn High Mass. For over 30 years before the death of the gentle warrior of Ars, pilgrims coming to see the Curé had asked, "Where is the saint? We want to see the saint." The Curé was not long dead when a movement was started to begin the process by which Rome officially confers the title of sainthood. In 1872, Jean-Marie Vianney was declared venerable, the first step toward canonization. A black marble slab covered the grave where the Curé's body lay, and to it came scores of pilgrims praying for favors, material and spiritual. Nearby a church was rising dedicated to Saint Philomena, the church that Father Vianney had always longed to build. In 1905, Rome conferred on him the title of Blessed, and a little chapel in Saint Philomena's church was dedicated to him. His body was placed in a reliquary over the altar, and the shrine became known for the miracles obtained through the intercession of the humble priest. The Pope had declared Blessed Jean-Marie Vianney the patron of the parish priests of France, and they flocked to his chapel. Frequently Masses followed in succession from dawn to noon. As priests went to the altar of the chapel of Saint Philomena's church, asking help in the performance of their duties from the priest, who had done his work so supremely well. In 1925 he was declared a saint. The Pope now announced that he was the patron of the parish priests of the world. From all over the world they came, singly and in pilgrimages. They prayed in the church and in the chapel. They saw the wooden confessional, where, through long and painful years, the Curé of Ars sacrificed himself to save more souls for God. They saw the old house, which had been his home, the house made dreadful so many nights by a furious, frustrated Satan. They saw the simple room where he died, unchanged since he had left it. They prayed that they might share the dedicated spiritual courage of the simple farmer's son, who could not learn, but learned. They thought of the obstacles in his path to ordination, obstacles which would have defeated a less valiant soul, but which he overcame. They remembered his tenderness to those in sorrow, his vigor with those in sin. They bowed their heads in recollection of the peasant Jean-Marie Vianney, who for over 40 years was the Curé of Ars, and who is now Saint Jean-Marie Vianney, beloved throughout the world.